Tonight, the city breathes not with armies or acclamations, but with the soft scratch of styluses across wax, each mark as quiet as a footstep on marble. In narrow offices lined with oil lamps, priests bend over tablets where time itself is reshaped, days shifted forward or backward like weights on a scale. Markets, courts, and O's all wait for their decision, suspended in the still air of a chamber where one gesture can make tomorrow arrive late or never arrive at all. The forum may echo with debates, yet every argument bends beneath this hidden power, the command not of legions, but of calendars. A consul's campaign can vanish into mist if a day is erased. A farmer's harvest can spoil if the month is stretched too long. The empire itself ticks to the rhythm of men who carry no swords, only the authority to say whether the sun has risen into a new day or remained captive in yesterday. So lower the lights. Let your breath settle with the weight of the hours being moved like quiet stones across a board. And if these journeys through the night keep you company, you might one day choose to return, perhaps, even to leave a small mark of your own, the way a listener leaves their place in the margin. Until then, the story will keep its pace, waiting as patiently as the calendar itself. And if this quiet keeps you company for a while, stay as long as you like. The story will keep unfolding, whether your eyes stay open or drift closed before the last page turns. The lamps of Rome are still burning on their tablets, and the wax waits patiently for another stylus to press a line. A day may be stolen, returned, or stretched until it frays, but for now the city holds its breath in the pause between hours. What follows is not a clash of legions, but the subtler rhythm of time itself being bent, where every adjustment is both a command and a secret written in silence. Rome often trusted its quietest bureaucrats with the loudest power, the calendar. Their offices smelled of ink, oil, and warm tablets left out in the sun. A clerk leaned over a wall calendar, scratched in neat Latin letters, counting market days with the same care a baker counts loaves. In the forum, senators debated laws and treaties, yet many of their choices could be undone by a priest with a stylus who declared, very calmly, that today was not the day after yesterday. The pontiffs, guardians of sacred time, did not command legions. They commanded intervals. A city that swore oaths by days, not by swords, was held in place by men who carried no shield beyond a wooden pointer. The office of time worked like a library that shelved moments. A pontifex climbed the steps of the Regia, the priestly headquarters, and on a public board, he marked which days were lawful for courts, which were market days, and which were forbidden for political business because the gods had bookings. These marks had names: fasti for the lawful ones, nefasti for the hush, these are sacred ones, and they spread across the month like tiles. The priest's handwriting decided whether a trial could begin or must hover like a pigeon unsure about a windowsill. In an age before precise clocks, the city measured itself with sunrise and with announcements. It was enough for a magistrate to ask, "Is it a court day?" and to receive an answer signed in wax. The answer could be yes or no, or yes dash, but dash not dash before dash the dash augur dash arrives, which is the bureaucratic equivalent of after lunch. Between February and March, there lived a slippery door named Mercedonius. He opened only when the priest said so. If winter tried to drift too far into spring, the pontiffs could insert a bonus month that made the year behave again, like adding an extra drawer to a chest you've overfilled. Intercalation, they called it. You take a year that is slightly short and stretch it with an inserted block, the way a tailor quietly lets out a seam. This was not astronomy, at least not in the practical sense. It was authority with a sundial as a prop. The pontiffs claimed the sun's logic, but they held the lever that moved court dates, rent dates, tax dates. If the city as debts were due on the calends, and the calends were napped over by new days, the city nodded and slept a little longer. The rule did not raise its voice. It cleared its throat and changed a date. There were rituals for adding time, the kind of procedures that make even a bonus month feel ordinary. A day began with water poured over a priest's hands, and with shadows measured on a gnomon, an elegant word for stick that tells the truth. A deputy recited a formula so short that it sounded inevitable. The gods approve, the year requires. The city obeys. A herald read the notice on the steps, and the crowd listened because the notice was about their bride, their court summons, their daughter's wedding that now fell on a different afternoon. If you string beads and then quietly add one more, the string looks the same until you count. Intercalation felt like that. The markets were aligned by simple arithmetic that nonetheless smelled faintly of incense. People adjusted themselves to the revised rhythm. The butcher opened his stall on the 8th day, or was it the 9th, depending on how you counted the nundinae, those Roman market cycles that wore sandals. Merchants did sums on scrap bark. A debtor felt both heavier and lighter, depending on whether the new block of time slid him closer to payment or nudged the deadline out of reach. Lawsuits hung like laundry in a courtyard, waiting for a day with legal sunshine. And if the calendar said the sun was not shining, then it wasn't, even if everyone was squinting. The new days had an ordinary face. They were announced with chalk and a familiar voice. Nothing dramatic happened. The city merely moved its weight from one foot to the other and explained that the dancer had always intended to do so. At the edges of practicality, this all became a subtle weapon. Not a sword, more of a door wedge. A consul who wanted his term to ripen like a fig sometimes found it extended by the priestly decision to squeeze additional days into the year, which made his 12 months quietly longer. A general who preferred to start his campaign under a favorable name for the day could find the schedule obligingly shifted. Juries were suddenly unavailable. Witnesses were suddenly holy. The city itself had a schedule that behaved like a friend who helps you stall. If your rival's trial was scheduled for the 30th, and you stamped in a boundary that said the 30th was now, technically not here yet, the trial became a rumor with excellent posture. Everyone learned the soft grammar of the calendar. Senators coughed in agreement. Tribunes shook their heads but consulted the fasti anyway. A kind of administrative poetry took root. Call this day lawful, that day sacred, this span added. Even farmers outside the walls felt the tug when market cycles shifted, and the moon's visible mood could not persuade the priests as efficiently as the spreadsheet made of wax. The oddest thing, which no one found odd after a while, was that nothing in the forum needed to change tone. The priest did not thump the board. He wrote, and then people moved. If a modern person were to translate the scene into our own bureaucracy, it would feel like discovering that the person who controls the submit button on a website also controls the month of February. The calendar's flexibility produced its most famous tangle in what later memory called the Year of Confusion. The rhythm had been manipulated for years, partly out of habit and partly for advantage, until the seasons slid off their hooks. Festivals appeared 2 weeks early. Winter was not where you left it. The city blinked like a man whose hourglass had been turned twice without his consent. To fix it, the priest stretched the year until it groaned far more than a tidy intercalary stitch. Imagine receiving a calendar at the new year with a polite note. We realized last year was drifting. This one will be 50 days longer. Please hydrate. There's probably no better way to age a population by paper. The joke in taverns was that Rome had successfully conquered time by giving everyone more of it to cue in. When a policy is almost invisible, it can be carried by a whisper. The priests of discretion, who knew exactly how long the year would be, made them useful to politicians who preferred their victories to occur on auspicious dates and their trials to languish on forbidden ones. No law needed to be overturned. It only needed to be inconveniently unschedulable. A defendant found that his accusers could not proceed before a deadline that now traveled on fresh legs. A creditor discovered that late fees were not late anymore if the month expanded like dough left near the hearth. Harbor taxes felt easier or worse depending on whether the shipment arrived before or after a block of days that hadn't existed when the sailors left Ostia. A city like ours might call this calendar management. Rome called it piety. Every few minutes, some minor absurdity drifts by. Auspices were consulted before a public meeting. If birds flew the wrong shapes, the gathering dispersed. But on days marked nefasti, the omens could be flawless, and the answer remained no, because the chalk said so. More practically, marriage contracts chose specific dates and avoided others not for romance, but compliance, and a leftover superstition suggested that signing on the calends was unlucky, possibly because rent was due then, and it's difficult to promise love when the landlord is knocking. One Roman writer complained that the city had more named days than it had patients, which is also the basis of half of modern calendar apps. Then came the reset. Julius Caesar, who liked to solve problems in a way that made everyone remember his name, renovated the year with help from Alexandrian astronomers who treated stars like serious accountants. He had noticed the drift, and he had also noticed that the drift produced opportunity. When he chose to remove that opportunity, he did so with the thoroughness of a man reorganizing a warehouse by knocking down the walls. The new plan took the sun's annual lap seriously, counted roughly 365 and a quarter days, and distributed them into months that behaved. To square the bucks, a transitional year was inflated to a comic size, and after that, the months stayed put. Every fourth year, a day slipped into February, like an extra olive in a jar. Priests would still bless and forbid days, but they would not move the furniture every winter. The reform was a sweep as much as a system. Market cycles were pinned to predictable intervals. Courts regained their rhythm. A contract signed for the Ides of March would reach the Ides at the same speed next year. Rome exhaled. There were complaints, of course. Some citizens had been gently successful in the previous fog and found the new clarity glaring. A calendar that had once obeyed whispers now listened mostly to the sun, which does not take meetings. Old rituals still mattered, but it now sat inside a structure that could be consulted by anyone with a table and a pencil. If you're awake and you enjoy tidy things, you may be smiling. If you're asleep, the calendar will smile for you. Yet the sweep was not absolute, and the patience of paperwork survived. The priests still announced which days were good for public business. Festivals went on being carefully placed, because gods, as all administrators know, prefer to find their ceremonies where they left them. The everyday machinery kept clacking softly. Clerks in the forum chalked the fasti on walls. Parents argued lightly over which date sounded nicest for a child's naming. Builders delayed a cornerstone because that morning belonged to sacred silence. In some offices, the memory lingered that a date is also a debate, only slower. Caesar's triumph settled the big argument, but the small ones continued to pour water over their hands and consult a stick that told the truth more politely than people do. We still carry pieces of this old toolkit like buttons from a vanished coat. Months remain a Roman miscellany. Some are named for numbers that no longer match their position, because once upon a time, March had the dignity of beginning the year and pushed everything else forward, and the habit stuck like ivy. September means 7, while taking ninth place with complete confidence. October, a dignified 10, lives at 11 and doesn't mind. Even weekdays enter with a Roman accent. In the old rite, the extra day doubled a preceding gate, as if saying, "We will sit on this step twice," a custom that still echoes in legal language, sardined into February. The quiet legacy is not the power to edit time at a priest's whim, but the knowledge that time can be domesticated by lines on a page, and that people will line up their lives to walk between the lines. If you trace the story to a personal scale, you see how gently tyrannical a calendar can be. Budgets prefer clean months. Harvests, weddings, and paydays keep their appointments not with the moon, but with the ledger. The city's noise lowers when no public business is allowed, rises when elections are opened, droops on days of rest. When Caesar's plan survived the centuries, it did so because it was useful, like a broom. It even adapted to future adjustments by the cautious addition of new rules, the Gregorian correction much later. With its habit of skipping a leap day most centuries, yet the Roman skeleton remained upright as a column. The priests lost their lever, but they kept their job, to say aloud which days are which. A modern weather forecaster does something similar for rain. Neither controls the sky. Both control the schedule. The most charming detail may be the Roman insistence that truth enters with ceremony. When the priest marked the day on the board, he was not merely reporting, he was enabling. People watched a date become legal right there in chalk, like a tram arriving because its number appeared. A magistrate could hold court on a fastest day with confidence. A shopkeeper could plan shipments on the Nundinay with less second-guessing. Soldiers could write home with reliable promises. Even the grumblers admitted that a city that agrees on what today is becomes a city capable of anything tomorrow, including a nap. There is, in the end, something soothing about an empire that paused to ask its priests if Tuesday was even allowed. The men with calendars did not need armor. They owned a diction that turned chaos into errands. They stood between the stars and the baker and said, in effect, that such and such a morning belonged to law, and such an afternoon belonged to him. They could be manipulative. They could be mischievous. They could be corrupt without raising their voices. But they also taught a lesson that the reformed calendar kept. That time is not only what the sun does. It is also what a community decides to do together at 10 in the morning. So picture the board on the wall, neat letters, some smudges where a finger tested the wax, an apprentice sharpening a stylus because sharpened stili are more persuasive than sharpened swords in this room. A senator wanders by and nods because the dates are legible and therefore the Republic is safe today. A bride's mother peers at the festival list and murmurs approval where the auspicious days are clustered like olives in a bowl. A merchant counts his trips to market by tapping a pattern on his thigh. Work, 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 buy. Work, 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 buy. A debtor counts backwards from a due day and smiles when the leap day drops into his path like a pillow. The sun drops into the west on schedule and forgives the city all its arithmetic. And if, while you listen, your own day stretches one finger width longer, that is the old magic at work. It is not mystical, it is clerical. It is the calm announcement that this minute, like a well-tended garden, has its borders trimmed. Tomorrow will arrive when the calendar allows it, as it always does, with the quietest of trumpets. The pen lifts. The board has room for one more mark. The city yawns. The priests put away their wax and wash their hands. Nothing concludes. The days keep walking, obedient and soft-shoed, and we walk with them until we drift, gently, out of step and into sleep. You might not expect bedtime to be supervised by a medieval clerk with a scale and a ledger, but the most reliable lullabies in old market towns were sung by weights and measures. Picture a narrow street at dawn, shutters blinking open, the baker's door breathing out a warm fog, and a small man in a wool cap laying brass weights on a balance with the intimacy of someone counting sheep. Somewhere a bell says this is a market day, which is a very busy way of announcing that bread will continue to exist. Beside the bell, the assize of bread and ale wah, with the short purpose, waits on a nail. It is an English rule from the 13th century that solved an apparently simple question in an endlessly complicated manner. How big should a loaf be when wheat is cheap? And how much should it shrink when wheat is not feeling sociable? If you're still awake by the time we reach the part where the clerk measures beer foam with a stick, feel free to subscribe, but really don't strain anything. Someone has already done the measuring for you. The law's mood was practical, sleepy, and stubborn. Because grain prices wandered through the year like a sheep with opinions, a fixed bread price would either flatter the baker or bankrupt him, depending on harvest, wind, and boat timetables. So the assize decided the price could sit still and the loaf could wander. When wheat became expensive, bread would quietly lose weight while keeping its polite face. When wheat was cheap, bread would become generous, gaining ounces as if the bakery had been blessed by a benevolent draft. Clerks loved this because it could be graphed if they had known what a graph was. The statute tables linked the price of grain to the weight of a penny loaf, with lines as earnest as multiplication tables. We now call this sort of thing a sliding scale. They would have called it common sense written slowly. Every town repeated the ritual differently, but with shared props, a balance, a set of municipal weights that lived in a wooden box like well-behaved animals, and a board or parchment with numbers and the patience of a millstone. The bread was weighed as if it were testimony. Too heavy was a kindness that no one prosecuted. Too light was an argument. The inspector sliced the loaf, because it was rude to accuse the whole before examining a portion, and placed a piece on the pan. The brass weights took their seats on the other pan with the authority of small planets. When the beam balanced, eyes rested. When it failed, quills stirred. The baker could protest that the air had been unusually buoyant, or that the oven behaved shyly, but the scale resumed its soft arithmetic. Nothing makes a better lullaby than a mechanism that refuses to care. The town's minute logic extended into delicious absurdity. Flour cannot be conveniently standardized from mill to mill, so the laws standardized behavior. Bakers were instructed to keep a loaf of advantage, a friendly extra loaf out of every so many baked, to cover the random famine of mistakes. This loaf had a short life expectancy. If you are picturing a teenager whisking it away with professional speed, you are not entirely wrong. Bakers mix flour grades to stabilize texture, the way a modern person mixes playlists to stabilize mood. They salted as law allowed, neither to be miserly nor to invite thirst-based profit at the alehouse. The most charming clause warned bakers not to put dirt into dough. This seems obvious until you consider that a medieval street was a persuasive argument for filtration. Dirt was not taxed, flour was. Ale stood next to bread in the statute as title because it was the civic answer to water's unpredictable conversation with wells. Ale had to be sold honest, not feeble, not aggressive, not priced as if brewed by philosophers. The ale taster, an actual job, frequently reappointed with great public enthusiasm, tried a sample from each brewer. There is a famous story about an ale taster who, after a long afternoon of civic duty, fell asleep on a bench and was fined for sleeping on the job, but the fine was promptly used to buy him a pillow. The law did not measure happiness, which is as well, but it did measure vessels, a quieter heroism. A standard gallon held enough to be useful, yet small enough to be lectured. If a mug were too narrow at the bottom, the publican would be told gently that beer was not a taper. The rhythm of enforcement was not dramatic, it was weekly. Proceedings happened under the name of the Leet Court, which sounds like a medieval chat room, but was more like a quarterly neighborhood meeting, supervised by people who owned cloaks. Minor offenders were fined pennies that put roofs on small civic projects. Major offenders were shown the pillory, which doubled as a performance review. A baker convicted of persistent lightness in his loaves might be mounted on a tumbrel and paraded with underweight, bread tied around his neck, which is both very literal and very educational. The crowd did not riot. It merely learned, which is an underrated pastime. The point was not humiliation. The point was calibration by spectacle. In a city that measured bread with scales, it is perhaps not surprising that it measured fairness with ropes and wheels. If you listen closely, you can hear the bureaucracy humming like a mill race. The clerks compiled price lists for wheat, barley, and oats using information from local markets and from the elegantly named assayers, who were not spiritual advisors but price translators. When harvests failed north of town and succeeded south, the figures negotiated under a window. From these prices, the clerk announced the permissible weight for a farthing loaf, a halfpenny loaf, and the aristocratic penny loaf. The obvious modern analogy is dynamic pricing, but with more linen. A micro hook if your eyelids are still cooperative. One town kept a set of official test loaves baked weekly and stored them in a chest in the guild hall, each wrapped in linen and labeled by date. Visitors could lift them to feel justice in their hands. The mice also lifted them for similar reasons. The law left odd footprints. Bakers, who were paid by volume and affection but by mass in court, developed a baker, as dozen a bonus 13th loaf for every 12 sold to protect themselves and keep the scale as pointer winking straight. This practice was not nobility. It was math expressed as generosity. The public remembered the generosity and forgot the math, which is how most traditions survive. Another tiny tradition, bread marks. Every baker impressed a pattern into his loaves, a kind of yeasted signature crosses, stars, initials that allowed the inspector to identify the source of any lightness or dough with uninvited pebbles. In a sense, a medieval bakery had a brand long before branding, and its logo was baked literally in-house. We are supposed to discuss punishments, although it feels unbedtime to do so. They were brisk, public, and usually dull, which is perhaps why they worked. The pillory held the head and hands. The tumbrel introduced the body to the idea of wheels. The cucking stool introduced repeat offender brewsters to water in a way that did not improve the ale. Fines were calculated with a neatness that would make a bookkeeper say, A first offense might cost a small sum, a second a larger sum, a third the privilege of baking for a fixed period time measured again, and returned to you at maturity. The moral edge of it all was not crime and punishment, but weight and equivalence. A light loaf received a heavy response so that the scales of town and oven always returned to level. We should not imagine this system as perfectly honest, because people are rarely that tidy. Some bakers pushed the incline of their tables so cooling loaves slid away from inspectors like shy trout. Some alewives rigged a smaller pot to measure with, a kind of medieval shrinkflation. And there was the perennial complaint of corner cutting. Sacks of flour weighed a little less after a bumpy ride. Moisture content pretended to be weight. Yet the presence of the ledger and the public ritual suppressed the worst habits, much as a visible clock suppresses timelessness. Even the cheaters learned to cheat within limits and at a pace compatible with afternoon tea, which had not yet been invented but was sorely needed. The daily theater of weighing affected everyone's sense of time. Market day gained a second identity as Confirmation Day, when the town confirmed that the world was still measurable. Good harvest years acquired a roundness and memory because the loaves felt secure in the hand. Bad years taught fingers to expect smaller weight and to be grateful for the return of heft. An elderly woman might stroke the side of a loaf while telling a child how a slim season feels, and what numbers on the board mean, which is really economic education disguised as snack time. A monk kept a tally of prices in a margin and noticed patterns long before the word statistics learned to tighten its belt. The assize also solved problems we have forgotten we had. Bread once came in shapes and sizes determined by household habit. Some families baked, others bought. Some ovens were public, some private. In crowded towns, ovens were rented by the hour like seats in a very warm library. The law made these arrangements shareable by making them legible. Your loaf could be weighed against my loaf, because both were answerable to the same table of values. In that sense, the statute is really the invention of comparable bread, which is not a poetic achievement until you are hungry. By the time new rulers and new currencies fiddled with the statute, the habit of weighting loaves remained. It ducked into parish regulations, resurfaced as pamphlets, and kept living in the careful hands of bakers who did not wish to argue with balances before breakfast. The Industrial Revolution arrived with steam and precision, and the measuring spirit grew satisfyingly loud. Scales moved from counter to factory, weights moved from brass to decimal. Bread moved into sliced uniformity with a military haircut. Yet the old sliding scale continued to wink at the new machinery whenever we remembered to be moody. The legal scaffolding eventually took a new name trading standards and marched into the future with clipboards. Packaging acquired its own poetry: net weight, tear, gross, words that sound heavier than they are. Bakeries learned to package by weight printed on the bag, which is simply the medieval rule with better typography. A modern packet of crackers, say it softly contains fewer crackers than last year's packet because energy costs rose and grain yields hiccuped. A medieval baker would feel at home in this conversation, except that he would wonder why we do not provide a 13th cracker, which is probably a missed branding opportunity. If we return to the beginning of the day, we can fall asleep in the middle of a bread queue, and nobody will mind. The inspector approaches a small crowd watching as if they were about to see a sheepdog demonstration. He slices, weighs, and nods. The nod is the true instrument of government. A young apprentice stands straight in a flour cloud, holding a peel like a flag, learning that honesty is heavy and worth the lifting. A brewer carries a paddle that looks exactly like a prop for stirring the sea. She is brewed to a recipe so old the measurements are feelings, but the ale passes the taste that stands in for a yardstick. The town crier wanders by announcing not a crisis, but a correction. The price of wheat has improved, and with it the weight of the loaf, and with it the mood of the afternoon. The tiny absurdities continue because they are restful. One town required that bread for the poor be made in extra large rounds, so one loaf could be divided among exactly 8 households without argument, saving both time and knives. Another required that bakers mark not only a symbol, but the day as price class on the crust itself, so a loaf could confess in court without unseemly delay. Some places tied a ribbon to the balance beam whenever the permissible weight changed, as if the scale were celebrating a birthday. In a disputed case, there are records of judges teasing a loaf apart to see whether the crust had been cunningly thickened to hide shyness within. Court transcripts include the phrase, "The loaf is under confession," which is more comforting than it sounds. A note on flavor whispered, "Taste barely enters the law. It is assumed like weather." The statute, grandly unconcerned with our modern definitions of delicious, controls the external dignity of the loaf while the town's gossip handles the rest. People do not line up twice for blandness. Thus the bakers, though they were regulated with enthusiasm, pursued excellence for reasons unrelated to fines. They competed with each other in soft ways, shapes, timing, scorch patterns, the pinch of salt you could hear rather than taste. The law chased weight. The people chased joy. Between these two pursuits, bread acquired a reputation for reliability that hums through Western history like a baritone. When someone swears to share their bread, they are promising more than calories. They are promising to maintain the scale. It is nearly midnight by iron candlelight. The ledger sleeps face down. The official weights go back into their box, nested like a family, the smallest one either missing or purposely hidden where only the inspector can find it. The oven cools, making faint ticking noises that teach the rafters how to remember heat. The baker slides a last loaf toward the pantry, the way one shepherd slides one sheep through a gate at the tail end of a count. A cat learns the number 12 and the concept of patience. On the wall, the chart of the assize sighs with the draft from the door. Tomorrow may bring a new wheat price, and therefore a new loaf weight, and therefore a new small way of being fair, which is surely the gentlest revolution on record. If you are still listening and you feel your mind counting without wanting to, Let the numbers lead you nowhere at all. Loaf heavier, loaf lighter, brass weight, penny loaf, farthing loaf, the obliging 13th. The clerk's quill scratches a symbol that says sufficient. The scale levels with a visible quietness that spreads to the bench, then to the cat, then to the floorboards, then to us. The town accepts the verdict of a beam of wood, a handful of metal, a table of numbers, and a human nod. In the end, that is all the assize ever was. A community that refuses to be tragic about hunger and chooses instead to be precise about bread. The long law does not close with drama. It closes with routine. Next week will look like this week, but weighed slightly differently. The week after that will be familiar again. The bell will sound nearly the same and still mean bread. The baker will lift 12 loaves and then remember the 13th as if startled by his own kindness. Somewhere an ale taster will doze and, found in a dignified slump, will be given another pillow. And on the balance, when no one is watching, the pointer will settle exactly at the line because it has always preferred the middle. Now we leave it there, motionless, while the oven cools and the ink dries and the town, satisfied by arithmetic, drifts off into the warm, measured dark. You might not expect the schedule of the Roman Empire to be edited with something as gentle as a priest. A wax tablet, but the empire's calendar was for a long time a soft piece of furniture that the pontiffs nudged when politics needed a cushion. It began in lamplight. The city turned from night to morning like a page being pressed flat, and in a quiet room a man with clean hands, a stylus, and complete confidence looked at a wall covered in small incisions. Each row marked a month, each notch a day, and at the end of certain lines there was the possibility of a crease. Rome called it intercalation, adding a small, polite month between February and March. The priest did not wear a helmet. He wore the sort of expression a person puts on while adjusting a clock that is almost, but not quite, on time. If you are still awake by the time we reach the part where they consult shadows in a courtyard, feel free to subscribe. But honestly, don't tire yourself. Even the priests took breaks between decisions. The office of time was older than many offices with better uniforms. The Pontifex Maximus, whose title sounds like a marble staircase, supervised the calendar with a committee of pontiffs. They did not set laws with swords. They set them with syllables like cowens, nones, and ides, which are simply the Roman way of labeling the beginning, the not quite middle, and the suddenly middle of a month. The year itself was a living argument. Some said it was 355 days long, because that number fit their arithmetic and their crops. Others said the sun was louder than arithmetic. In practice, the city used a lunarish year and then borrowed days as needed, slipping in a whole extra slice called Mercedonius after February, as if February were a drawer that opened onto a hidden compartment. This kept the civic calendar and the seasons from walking away from each other like guests who have just realized they meant different restaurants. Intercalation was not done with adventure. It was done with ceremony and a kind of shrug. The pontiffs watched the skies in the respectable Roman way, which is to say they watched them while also keeping an eye on lawsuits, election dates, and whether a general's triumph would happen on a convenient afternoon. The calendar arranged taxes and court sessions, a seating chart of the year's seriousness. Time had to fit markets, not the other way around. When days were added, notices were read in public, and ordinary people did what ordinary people do when told that a month has suddenly introduced a cousin. They nodded, bought olives, and went home by the same streets. Debts rose and fell on schedule unless the schedule developed an extra step. The miracle is that everyone tolerated the extra step because the extra step was announced politely. There are hints that these decisions were guided by things that look like science from across a long distance, the length of a shadow at noon, the behavior of water clocks that dripped with bureaucratic patience, small astronomical tables that said, essentially, the sun prefers this speed. A young assistant might have gone out with a gnome on, which is a stick that is proud enough to have a Greek name and marked where the shadow fell at the same hour every few days. When the shadow began arguing with the calendar, the priest began discussing with colleagues whether Mercedonius should be invited to the year again. Nothing was urgent. Rome distrusted a hurry the way cats distrust bathtubs. Yet inside this slowness, there was leverage. A magistrate whose term ended in December might benefit from the priests adding extra days in November. An ally could be rewarded with a calendar that responded to his schedule the way a polite door responds to a hand. This was not seen as cheating. It was seen as flexibility, the civic equivalent of moving a meeting so the important person can attend. Microhook here if you need one to keep the eyelids at half-mast. One pontifex supposedly kept a list of all pending trials on the back of his calendar and practiced a professional innocence about intercalation that fooled nobody and offended few. Rome preferred obvious arrangements to secret ones. The calendar was very obvious, carved on stone and read aloud. The rituals of adding time were as tranquil as a kitchen recipe. The formula itself was admittedly confusing. The Romans intercalated a month of either 22 or 23 days on a schedule that made sense to them, and to no one else, but the practice was steady. A herald announced the decision in the forum, the way one might announce that pears are in season. Markets adapted with the professional resilience of markets. A few extra days meant rent due later, interest counted longer, and ship cargoes timed for a slightly different tide. If you imagine a merchant squinting at a wax tablet and adjusting numbers with a stylus, you have the correct amount of drama. The city lived inside this arithmetic like a person inside a very comfortable coat. Courts were tethered to the calendar in small persuasive knots. A summons specified not just a day, but its place within the web of calends, knowns, and ides, and these threads moved predictably unless Mercedonius appeared. When it did, court dates slid like beads on a string, keeping their order but changing their position. Lawyers who lived for elaboration learned to enjoy the slide. Jurors were not eager men in cloaks rushing to judgment. They were farmers and shopkeepers who wanted to go home for dinner, and the extra month gave them both more time to deliberate and more time to decide they had deliberated enough. Delays did not feel like delays when everyone's hourglass tilted the same way at the same time. Out in the fields, the farmers cared less about what the month was called and more about whether the moon and the taxes agreed about harvest. Plant too early for the calendar and the frost would edit your optimism. Plant too late for the tax collector and your optimism would be audited. Intercalation smoothed both edges. It was like adding an extra plank to a bridge, just where the river's current kept slapping at travelers' sandals. No one thanked the carpenter because the bridge did not collapse, and that is exactly the kind of praise the calendar was built to receive. But here, if we keep our voices whisper soft, the priest's little lever becomes a device. Time became useful in politics the way a spoon is useful in soup. A consul hoping to extend his year could hope for the gift of a long November. An enemy might enjoy the punishment of a short one. Elections that could not be won might be postponed into elections that could. A festival might catch a better wind on the social calendar. All of this was accomplished with the click of a stylus and the tone of an announcement that did not sound like a choice at all. In the courtroom of history, this is called manipulation. In the office of time, it was called housekeeping. Occasionally, housekeeping forgot to dust. The city drifted days away from the sun. This drift is easy to imagine if you've ever ignored the update time automatically setting on a computer for too long. The months wandered backward through the seasons in small, unalarming steps. Grape harvest crept toward hotter weather. The winter solstice approached days that did not feel wintry. For the average citizen, this was manageable. Markets occur whatever the climate thinks, and togas have layers. But soldiers in far provinces noticed that spring campaigning saw more summer than a spring campaign requires. Meanwhile, the priest's discretion grew more discretionary. The habit of intercalation was sometimes neglected, either through distraction or by design. By the time anyone called it a problem, it was a snugly worn habit. Then came the year of confusion, a name that sounds like a comedy but was more like a large tidy-up. The exact mechanics are a bedtime puzzle, but the gist is this. Rome realized that the calendar and the sun were politely ignoring each other. To repair the relationship, an extra stretch of days along Mercedonius, then even more, was added to reboot the clock. Imagine waking from a nap and being told that the day has been extended by several hours for maintenance. People accepted it because the alternative was untidy. If you feel yourself drifting at this point, it's appropriate. So did the year. When Julius Caesar returned with the authority of victories and the practical brain of someone who liked bridges to meet in the middle, he looked at the calendar the way an engineer looks at a fence held together by anecdotes. He consulted astronomers from Alexandria, people who could persuade a ruler with diagrams and shadows that behaved themselves. They recommended solar regularity, 365 days, a quarterly organization of months, and every fourth year a quiet quarter day matured into a leap day. To a city that loved tables, this sounded like the best kind of table one with 4 legs of equal length. Caesar did not ease the empire into the new order. He marched it there, then polished the floor behind him. The Julian calendar reset the relationship between civic time and the sun with energetic symmetry. Months were assigned links that our knuckles still memorize. Festivals were given new addresses. The priests kept their tablets but lost their lever. Time moved from room temperature to refrigerator cold, consistent, reliable, and no longer flavored by the day's politics. The reform had the same energy as cleaning a desk so thoroughly that you find coins you did not know you owned. Rome sighed, counted properly, and went on with the business of empire. The old power of the pontiffs did not vanish. It simply stopped hiding in the calendar. They found other levers, omens, ceremonies, the complicated choreography of religion and law, but the year itself became inhospitable to editing. Not that it stopped all arguments. In later reigns, small mistakes and leap year counting crept in, and then later still, a pope in the Renaissance gave the calendar a tiny haircut to realign the equinox, the way a gardener trims a hedge that has offended astronomy. But Caesar's sweep established the tone. Time would remain a public utility, not a private instrument. The legacy is quiet and everywhere. Budget deadlines, school years, tax seasons, they still wear Roman tailoring. Our months bear the names that wiggle like Latin puppies: March for Mars, April for unknown etymologies that scholars discuss with affectionate shrugs, May and June for friendly deities, and the imperial months that never let you forget who renamed them. When you say on the Ides, you're speaking with a Roman accent. When you adjust a meeting because February got an extra day, you participate in a leap tradition that began as a negotiation among priests and became a number printed on paper. The system is so successful that we forget it is a system. We treat the calendar like rain, inevitable, sometimes inconvenient, and falling equally on everybody no matter how grand their umbrella. The small absurdities survive like coins and couch cushions. Farmers' almanacs still flirt with lunar advice while paying their rent to the sun. In some churches, the date of Easter wanders according to rules that would not surprise a pontiff with a shadow stick. Fiscal years begin in months that have nothing to do with January because budgets prefer to hibernate in April. Even our habit of spacing elections can feel like the echo of an old conversation. Time is an organizer, but it is also a polite bouncer at the door of events, letting them in one at a time to keep the room calm. We still believe, like those Roman priests, that order is not a prison, but a guideline printed in tidy columns. If you listen for it, you can hear the pen stroke that changed history's speed. It is not a dramatic sound. It is the scratch of a stylus across wax, and the murmur of a clerk repeating the count under his breath. Calende, nane, itis, and so on, a chant so mild it could be a lullaby. The calendrical office was not a place of thunder, but of whispers and shadows and patient arithmetic. The priests kept their heads down and their numbers neat. The markets complied. The courts were scheduled with dignified slowness. The soldiers marched when told. A city that conquered the world did so while moving days around like furniture, then finally fixed the furniture to the floor and decided it had always been that way. We can end, if end is the right word, in a conversation about time, with an image that requires exactly as much attention as you wish to give it. Picture a Roman priest, tidy as a librarian, stepping into a courtyard at noon. He plants his stick, watches the shadows settle, and nods. The nod is the empire's heartbeat. Somewhere a merchant crosses out a date and writes a new one without sighing. Somewhere a magistrate realizes his term will be slightly longer or slightly shorter and arranges his expressions accordingly. Somewhere a farmer turns the soil to a schedule that feels right because it has been supervised. And eventually, Caesar will arrange everything so the nod becomes automatic, which is both less romantic and much easier on everyone's lunch plans. If you're still listening, let the months drift past like laundry on a warm line. Intercalary February, brief Mercedonius, the long correction, the Julian sweep, the leap day's quiet surprise. Time sits down, the sun agrees. Priests put away their shadows. The city hums, every appointment now slightly less negotiable and therefore easier to ignore. You can relax with the comforting knowledge that tomorrow will arrive on schedule, not because someone important wills it, but because a calendar, once a politely adjustable thing, now prefers the dignity of habit. Close the ledger. Turn the tablet face down. Let the light fade through the courtyard while the shadow shows exactly what hour it is, which is the hour that is always best for falling asleep. You might not think the shape of a sheet of paper would have an opinion about your day, but if 4 does, quietly, like a librarian who knows where the book is and watches you find it anyway. Paper sizes are one of those topics no one puts on a birthday cake, and yet every office cupboard is a museum of rectangles that obey laws older than the copier that hums them into being. Tonight we'll drift through the centuries while nothing dramatic happens. Scribes sharpen knives for trimming, mills wheeze. Merchants argue about fractions of an inch the way clouds argue about where to rain. And a German physicist has a neat idea that behaves itself for 100 years. If you are still awake by the time we reach the part where envelopes have cousins with matching proportions, feel free to subscribe, but please don't strain. This is stationary history, and it encourages staying still. In the beginning, paper did not come in sizes. It came in parent sheets whose parents kept changing. Handmade sheets had decal edges, a phrase that sounds like a biscuit but is actually the soft, feathery border produced when pulp meets the frame and decides to rest. Every mill stamped its watermark ox, bell, star, sometimes a hand with a flower, so buyers could blame someone specific when margins misbehaved. Fold one of those big sheets in half and you had folio. Fold again for quarto, again for octavo. Fold until your fingers got bored and the type got small. Printers talked in these folds the way sailors talk in knots. None of it was standardized beyond the habit of folding, and yet libraries somehow grew in straight rows, proof that chaos can be stacked if you're patient. Names were soft too. There was foolscap, which had a jester's cap in the watermark, and went on to become a size in several countries, even when the jester retired. There was crown, demi, royal, and double elephant, which sounds like an insult, but is just a generous page for maps. England favored inches and tradition. France flirted with metric exuberance and a new republic. Italy had thoughts. Dutch mills had counter thoughts. A clerk asked to copy something on good demi could expect a sheet about so-and-so by such and such, with an allowance for the miller's personality. Office life developed small rituals to cope. People trimmed, people folded. People learned to pretend that a near match is the same as a match if you put it in a folder and walk away briskly. Somewhere in the 18th century, the Enlightenment looked at paper the way it looked at everything else and asked for a reason. A German physics professor named Georg Christoph Lichtenberg, who liked experiments that were tidy and jokes that were not, proposed a family of paper sizes whose sides kept the same ratio when folded in half. Industrialization put paper on a schedule. Machines, the Verdrinier, the cylinder mold spun pulp into rolls long enough to think in yards. Government offices expanded like polite octopi, each tentacle waving a form. Those forms wanted to be filed, and filing cabinets, which had to be rectangular so drawers could slide without sulking, preferred uniform stacks. Countries began to standardize, either because they loved order or because they couldn't find things. In 1798, the French revolutionaries proposed metric paper sizes because of course they did, and the numbers were clean enough to pass a sanitation inspection. It still didn't stick. Old habits are corrugated. Then came the peaceful drama of 1922, when Germany's standards bodied in, which sounds like dinner but stands for something complex, adopted the I series, based on Lichtenberg, a square root of 2 idea. A AO would have 1 square meter of area. Fold in half for a 1, again for a 2. Continue into the sensible middle where a 4 weights with its modest 210 by 297 millimeters. The glory of the system is how lazily it understands you. Need a pamphlet? Fold in a 3, stapled along the fold, and everything scales without asking anyone to hold a ruler. Need a poster? Use a 2, and it still looks like its smaller cousins, as if they were all raised at a strict but loving boarding school. DIN 476 became a kind of grammar, clauses of varying length, same sentence structure. Other countries noticed. Scandinavia adopted early because Scandinavia reads the room. The Netherlands followed. Japan, which met the metric system with a serious nod, formalized Ys B5 and A series sizes with the serene efficiency of people who remember where they left the tape measure. After the Second World War, international standards proliferated like well-behaved weeds. By 1975, ISO 216 gave the A series global permission to exist. Offices sighed in relief. Of course, there were exceptions. The United States continued to cherish letter size at 8.5 by 11 inches, a rectangle that obeys no mathematical poetry whatsoever and owes its existence to a combination of early American paper molds the reach of an average papermaker's arm, and the Bureau of Standards nodding in 1921. Legal size stretched to 14 inches because contracts elongate when watched. Canada, fond of compromise, used letter for home and A series for international diplomacy, like a person who switches languages at the dinner table. Every so often, an engineer designs a machine assuming a 4 on memo jams, and an office worker learns more about paper feed sensors than anyone needs to know. It is good to have mysteries. They keep the stationery cupboard interesting. Inside the S-series lives, the C-series envelopes that are perfectly proportioned to hold the A. S without folding resentment. A C4 envelope accepts a 4 flat. A C5 accepts an A5 booklet. A C6 asks a 4 to fold twice, like a letter learning yoga. There's also the B series posters and books that need sizes between the A. It's because sometimes you want a compromise that is already measured. All of it depends on that square root of 2, a number whose decimal never ends but whose consequences do. Copiers exploit the ratio with their enlarged to 141% and reduced to 71% buttons. Mathematical lullabies that let a page become bigger or smaller without growing ears. There is a calming joy in pressing A4 gives A3 141% and watching the machine comply like a butler. Paper history also smells faintly of chemistry. Early sheets were made from rags linen, cotton beaten into slurry. As literacy expanded faster than shirt wearing, rags proved insufficient and wood pulp took over, thanks to sulfite and craft processes that treated trees with gentle violence. The result was acidic paper that aged like bread, not wine. Libraries developed a habit of sighing. Later came alkaline buffering, archival permanence, and the soothing concept of 80 grams per square meter, the common weight for a 4 in places where people answer emails with printed attachments. You can learn a lot about an office by picking up a sheet and listening to the crinkle. The heavier the paper, the more a memo wants to be respected. The lighter the paper, the more it wants to be stapled. Mills standardized not just sizes but textures, smooth for laser printers, a slight tooth for handwriting, glossy for the magazines that prefer to show you fruit with impossible colors. Inkjet asked for coatings that keep drops from feathering. Laser asked for heat tolerance that does not produce origami at the exit tray. The unglamorous genius of ISO 216 is that it lets all these differences coexist on a single width and height. A4 is a stage. Any actor can step onto it and remember their lines. The audience is toner. With standards come rituals, those small repeated movements that make offices feel like monasteries with swivel chairs. Someone fans a ream to persuade static electricity to believe in forgiveness. Someone refills the tray and slips the wrapper into the recycling like a magician palming a card. Someone flips a missed sheet and tries again because paper always deserves a second chance. Micro hook for the patient, there is a word, reamer, for a person who makes reams. It sounds like an insult, is not, and remains 8 syllables short of fame. Adoption brought cartographic tidiness too. Architects drew plans on A1 and folded them into A4 sets that could live in filing cabinets rather than on floors where coffee happens. Government forms smiled their identical smiles. Stationers built a civilization of accessories, A4 ring binders, A4 manila folders, A4 in trays stocked like well-behaved geology. Even notebooks fell into line. The traveler's notebook arrived with a passport-sized brother. Graph paper squares acquired metric personalities. The most exciting thing about any of this is how little excitement was required. Where standards didn't travel, workarounds did. A4 documents sent to letter-sized printers clipped a few millimeters of last paragraphs, which is one way to end a sentence. Software learned diplomacy. Scale to fit became a checkbox with the power to save friendships. The world developed 2 average hole spacings for ring binders, and every international student learned both the way musicians learn 2 chords. Fax machines, those sighing ancestors, preferred A4. American offices often sent letter into the whistling mouth and watched the machine stretch images like taffy. Nobody cried. They put the paper in a folder and walked away briskly again. The backstage crew includes the people who measured all this. Standards committees are the librarians of industry. Men and women in tidy rooms agreed, at length and with tea, about tiny tolerances. A4 is allowed to deviate by a couple of millimeters because paper swells in humidity like polite bread. The corners are allowed to be not quite perfect right angles because nothing flat believes in perfection. They wrote documents no one reads for pleasure. Somewhere in the minutes of one of those meetings, you can almost hear a chair creak, a pencil tap, and the collective relief when the vote passes. It is the sound of civilization fastening a label onto a folder. The math itself remains a comfort. The square root of 2 equals the diagonal of a square with side 1. Turn that diagonal into the long side of a rectangle, and you can fold the rectangle in half forever, and it will always look like its parent. There is a whisper of infinity there, but a manageable infinity, like a mirror that only reflects 10 times because the electrician said that's enough. A zero's 1 square meter gives us clean prefixes, half the area, double the count. Printers order rolls in IO equivalent. Photocopiers speak percent as if it were a second language they learned at school and haven to forgotten. The story has a cast of minor characters who deserve their moment before you drift away. There was the foolscap pad, yellow with a red margin, beloved of legal clerks and school children, asked to write more than they know. There were carbon papers, blue ghosts that made duplicates before the photocopier freed everyone from smudges. There were ditto machines and their purple perfume. There was the staple, which came in sizes that claim universality with the same energy as umbrellas sold as one size fits all. And there were hole punches, 2 and 4 hole, devices that make small moons you find months later under the keyboard like archaeological confetti. And because paper also belongs to culture, we should mention how novels and poems quietly adapted. Manuscript guidelines double-spaced a 4 in Europe. Double-spaced letter in the United States became ways of keeping editors awake. Stationery became stationery because people married on it. Certificates liked 3 because achievement wants breathing room. Posters shouted in a 2 because protest is louder when the letters are big and the rectangle is comfortable. Photographers played with series frames so that images and mats could shake hands without bargaining. If there is romance in rectangles, it is the romance of consistent expectations. The rest is legacy. Every time you hit print and the little animation shows a page the size it will be, you are using geometry someone fought for less than a century ago. When a delivery slip tucks into a C5 envelope without complaint, you are holding the relief of 1,000 frustrated clerks who used to fold things twice, then 3. Times then reach for a larger envelope and pretend it was on purpose. When a copier offers 97% scaling and you choose it without knowing why, you're bowing to margins demanded by machines that have their favorite numbers. The world is held together by screws, passwords, and paper sizes. Only one of these 3 works without an update. We can end with something quieter than a conclusion because paper never concludes. It accumulates. Picture a single A0 sheet lying on a factory table large enough to cover a dinner for 6, pale as an unasked question. A knife slides, halves become holes. Stacks arise like drifts after a slow snow. In an office miles away, someone yawns and loads a ream into the tray. Another person tests a pen in the margin and writes nothing of consequence, which is the point. The rectangle receives the ink without comment. The day continues in tidy fractions. And if you're still listening, the shadows on your ceiling are almost the shape of a 4, and the distance between now and sleep is exactly and generously the square root of 2. You might not expect a handful of men with styluses to make wars a little longer, taxes a little later, and birthdays subtly disputed, but Rome's priests did all of that without raising their voices. They adjusted days the way a careful cook adjusts salt, a pinch at a time, and the stew of public life obediently changed flavor. This is not the calendar with fireworks and leap years delivered by emperors. This is the earlier, quieter machinery, when time in the city was a gate that opened if a pontiff whispered to it. The forum buzzed with sellers of olives, and somewhere under the shade of an old portico, a calendar board in red and white letters told citizens which days were good for lawsuits, which were good for markets, and which were good for doing absolutely nothing except hope the gods were in a reasonable mood. If you're still awake when we reach the part where a secret month is slipped between February and March, like a folded note in a toga, you can subscribe, or you can let your eyes subscribe to your pillow. I won't know either way, and the priests certainly never asked for feedback forms. The Romans began with a calendar that was honest about being inconvenient. It credited the moon with authority, let the month start when a thin silver edge appeared over the city's rooftops, and accepted that the sky sometimes hides for a while and leaves everyone pointing. Months had names that smelled of orchards and numbers, Martis for Mars, and agriculture that likes a bit of courage. Maius for growth, quintilis for 5, which is only charming until you realize the year doesn't begin on 1. And sextilis is not actually 6th once politicians get involved. The earliest year ran for 10 months, which sounds thrifty until you remember winter still insisted on existing, so time simply went quiet for a stretch while people counted by weather. Eventually 2 more months settled in like cats on a book you were reading. The pontiffs kept a tablet listing market days in an 8-day rhythm, and they painted certain letters to show when law courts could open their doors. A day marked F allowed lawsuits, and said no. A curious NP was for festivals with names too long for the title. If a citizen woke, washed, and walked to the forum to sue his neighbor for stealing a goat, the calendar could shrug and say, not today. A single red letter could make a goat temporarily legal. Agriculture. Being an outdoor professional, noticed the mismatch between lunar months and the sun's seasons. Vines refused to ripen by decree. Month after month, the moon took the Romans on a pleasant 12-step circuit of about 354 days, which left the solar year sulking 12 days behind by harvest. If nothing was done, the spring festivals would show up where frost still had the keys, and the sacred cows would be escorted to graze on invisible grass. The simple fix was to insert extra days now and then so that the year's shape matched the weather's. Many societies did it. The Roman version came with velvet ropes and a priest at the door. Between February and March-February, being devoted to rituals of cleaning and conclusion, the pontiffs could add a special month called Mercedonius. It began the day after the terminal festival, and it could be 27 days long, or sometimes not appear at all, which is a lot of power for a month with a name that sounds like a respectable fish. The rule was elegant on a blackboard. Add Mercedonius roughly every other year, and the drift will behave. The practice, alas, lived among people. People noticed that time is also politics, wearing a calendar as a cloak. A priest in charge of intercalation discovered that by adding a month, he could push elections back, or by skipping it, he could bring them forward. If your ally needed more time to campaign, time itself could be persuaded to give it. Debts were due on set days. Extend the year, and you have given generosity the shape of bureaucracy. Contracts matured when the calendar said so, not when Fix said so, and there were men who preferred the opinion of the calendar. So the Romans learned the experience that many modern office workers know. When a schedule is flexible, it becomes extremely helpful to the powerful and mildly bewildering to everyone else. Months arrived with an air of improvisation. Imagine being born on a day that exists only when the pontiffs remember it. You would have a birthday party like a comet, the math, if you can call it that, lived in public, scratched onto the large white tablet that hung where announcements gathered. A herald would climb and call, and the crowd would hear which days in the coming month were fasty for business, which were nefasti for worship, and which were half and half, like a cake with 2 flavors. It is a tiny, charming fact that the word calendar remembers that Calenday was the first day of the month, when interest was counted. Time and money, long-time roommates, already shared a shelf. Every 8 days a market, count the nundine, and bread knows when to leap in price. Farmers timed sowing by the stars, even as the city counted by the moon. One can picture a farmer mailing a polite note to the pontiffs. If you could keep April roughly near the blossoms this year, the beans would be grateful, the note would be received, admired for its handwriting, and filed. Occasionally the adjustment was handled with a small mechanical grace inside the month itself. A Remang February in a non-intercalary year had an arrangement of festivals more careful than a drawer of spoons. When the extra month arrived, February grew modestly shorter to make room for the guest. The whole operation took place in the official registers kept by the pontifices and their assistants, the scribes who lived with ink under their fingernails. We imagine them like quiet bureaucrats in invisible capes, walking through colonnades, while behind them the year rearranges itself as obediently as tiles on a floor. A modern analogy is the office. IT person who rolls out a silent update at 3 a.m. and solves 3 problems you did not know you had. Though in Rome, the update sometimes created the problem, almost a feature. Even in peacetime, timekeeping turns out to be fragile. Clouds can hide a new moon, and the observer gets to decide whether the month starts now or tomorrow. Priests are human and have relatives. Politics pulses through the quiet veins of procedure. A consul hoping to extend his command might whisper that the armies need stable seasons. Time might need to lengthen until harvests arrive safely and votes arrive safely later. A rival might argue the opposite. A proverb probably circulated that the gods approve of a timely intercalation, which is the sort of proverb that approves whatever is happening. In the lull of the night, the city's cranes rested, and the calendar board in the forum cooled beneath stars that did not mind what the pontiffs decided. Micro hook to keep your mind turning. Rome once fought a war while officially stuck in winter, because time refused to move forward without paperwork. There are worse enemies than barbarians. They include backlogged festivals, those amiable anchors of the year, drifted ever so slightly. The Purlia for shepherds risk wandering from pleasant April breezes toward wilder winds. The Feria of Ceres and Tellus worried the farmers like hens. The city's birthdays, yes, it had one could creep toward a date that called for warmer tunics. A priest might fix it with a single decision, and suddenly the world made sense again. Sensibility, however, invites overuse. An unscrupulous high pontiff could become a maestro of borrowed days, doling out calendars like favors. A modern official extending a deadline for a tax filing recognizes his ancestor in a white robe with a clean stylus and a thoughtful gaze. Every extension feels wise. None feel urgent. A state can drift on wisdom like a boat drifts on a lake, admiring the view while the shore slowly sails past. Daily life tolerated the wobble with the resignation of people who already tolerate uneven paving stones. Shopkeepers learned to keep both a practical almanac, what the sky and crops suggested, and the official tablet's instructions. Contracts included a phrase that translated roughly as according to the calendar that will be at that time, which is a very elegant way of admitting that the calendar needs to be checked later. Messengers ran. Heralds shouted. House slaves updated wax tablets with small, proud strokes. There is a comforting domesticity to it. A wife telling her husband to remember that next market is on the nose. Not the day after, because the pontiffs have done something clever, and she would like fresh fish while it is fresh. The husband nods, promises, and returns with olives because time is difficult. Julius Caesar enters. This sleepy narrative, like a man opening a window in a room everyone had forgotten to air. By the late Republic, intercalation had become sporadic enough that the civic year lagged badly behind the seasons. Harvest festivals thought they were winter holidays. Priests had not intercalated in the civil suffering of the 50s BCE. Some years were shorter, some longer, while civil war auditioned for a metaphor about confusion. Caesar, who was a priest himself Pontifex Maximus from a remarkably young age, had both the authority and the tidy temperament to fix it. He consulted astronomers, particularly one from Alexandria who knew his geometry, and in 46 BC, he performed a calendrical renovation that is still spoken of by people who like numbers and quiet heroics. First, he stretched the year to an outrageous length by adding extra intercalations until the sun and the civic year shook hands. Then he adopted a solar calendar of 12 months, totaling 365 days, with a leap day every 4th year. The pontiffs lost the power to slip Mercedonius into the year like a secret dessert. Rome gained the power to know when spring would arrive without asking anyone. It is often said that Caesar conquered Gaul. It is no less true that he conquered February. After this reform. The priests still had things to do, sacrifices are seasonal, and ink needs shepherding, but time itself became less of a negotiable instrument. Yet the habits lingered. Ordinary people remembered the earlier centuries as a time when the year could hesitate. Old men probably sat on steps and said that back in their day, April sometimes took a day off and nobody minded. A small, drowsy punchline. Even the Julian leap rule was initially misapplied, so leap days arrived a little too often, and Augustus had to stop them for a while to let the schedule cool down. Precision likes to be trained gently, but we promised this would not be a story with drama, so we can soften our gaze and look at the calendar not as a battleground, but as furniture. Think of the forum's calendar tablet, repainted each year, as a piece of civic furniture that told people when they might argue, when they might marry, when the city would dress itself in garlands, and the baker would put honey on everything. The priests, custodians of that furniture, dusted it by intercalating. They were times janitors, and every so often they put a new rug, the secret month, over a cold patch. When politics asked for decoration, the rug arrived sooner or later. When fields petitioned for sunlight to align with ritual, the rug was lifted and shaken. There is something endearingly domestic about it all. The empire will come later with eagles and legions. Here we have men with lists. You can hear the city's rhythm if you stand quietly enough in imagination. The 8-day market cycle produces a pulse bread, oil, gossip, bread again. Court days create little islands of tension followed by lakes of calm. Festivals spill wine like applause. On an intercalated year, the pulse pauses, then resumes step. Now and then a clerk scratches a correction, and two neighbors disagree for 5 minutes about whether it is next Thursday or the Thursday after next. Then shrug and buy figs. Micro hook, somewhere a poet cannot finish. A meter because the month acquired an extra day and he has to think of a rhyme for Mercedonius. He does, it scans, and he returns to sleep. The priestly power taught Rome a lesson modern people still learn in small ways. Whoever controls the schedule controls the story. A magistrate's term ended on a specific day. Extend the year and his dignity lingers, like the aftertaste of a well-cooked sauce. Candidates plan speeches, move the comitia, and their eloquence ripens or sours. Military campaigns depend on the campaigning season. A cleverly placed month could make a general stay in camp, polishing discipline. Time is the most obedient courier for policy because it looks like nature. If anyone complained, the priests could point to the moon and say they were only following it. The moon, which is famously unhelpful in arguments, offered no rebuttal, yet the priests were not villains. Often they were simply caretakers maintaining an inherited, reasonable system with the tools their city trusted. Intercalation prevented a farcical Rome, where harvest festivals met bare trees and sailors blessed ships trapped in rivers of ice. When intercalation was forgotten, life became comedic in the way that makes farmers frown. When it was used thoughtfully, rites met their seasons and the gods were assumed to approve, which is the nicest assumption a society can make about itself. The mistake was not intercalation, but the temptation to use it as a little lever for everything else. The city finally built a larger machine, the Julian calendar, to make that temptation unnecessary. In a way, the priests lost a toy and humans gained a year that did not wander. It's an even trade that feels strange only to those who enjoyed wandering. We can drift down from the forum now and step into a kitchen. A Roman cook puts a pinch of salt into a pot of lentils and then hesitates. Is tomorrow a market day for fresh herbs? She asks her neighbor, who consults a wax tablet. The neighbor answers with a smile that could mean anything and adds that the priests have updated the board again. The cook decides to make do with yesterday's celery. Lunch tastes of ordinary time. Across the city, a banker flips past the list of interests due on the calends and savors how official time makes money feel solid. A farmer in the countryside looks up at the Pleiades and decides to plant, while half remembering that the priest has said something about a new month. He prefers the stars. The calendar is the same for all of them and also different. A civic recipe, adjusted at the margin if you're still awake, and the odds are yawning in your favor. You might like a last detail that settles like a blanket. The priests announce the days by standing before the people and speaking the word kalari, to call, which is how the first day of the month became the calends. Time begins each month as an announcement, an active voice. Intercalation is another active voice to say, "There will be more February this year," is a sentence that changes the shape of weeks. Power, in this case, was a speaking part. Our modern calendars are printed, digital, automatic. They whisper instead of announce. Their authority is software and astronomy. Rome's authority for a long while was a man on steps calling. It is pleasant to fall asleep to that image, someone standing under a sky that does not care, naming the day, and a city murmuring back that it will arrange. Its errands accordingly dot, and so we fade with the knowledge that even very serious empires once relied on a soft pencil, and good intentions to keep April in April, if you woke there and asked what day it was. Someone would check the board and tell you with a little pride, as if the priest had given the city a fresh loaf each morning. On years when the loaf was larger because a secret month had been baked in, people ate it without comment. They paid debts when the calends told them to, went to court when the F on the tablet made room for arguments, and crowned their gods with flowers when the priests allowed the sun to be spring again. Nothing crashed. Nothing exploded. The empire to come was still stretching. In the quiet between festivals, a scribe wiped his stylus, closed the tablet, and took the long way home because the evening was kind. Somewhere a child asked when their birthday would be. The parent said, "Soon, as soon as the priests finish adjusting." The night agreed. The stars kept their own accounts, and time, domesticated for another month, lay down beside the Tiber and did not bark. You might not expect the quietest room in Rome to be the one that kept the city moving, but the office of time made more noise with chalk than most legions did with trumpets. On a wall near the Forum hung a tablet painted with tidy Latin letters, updated in careful strokes by men who carried styluses the way other officials carried swords. They did not enforce laws. They enforced days. Visitors drifted past it the way one drifts past a schedule in a train station, reading without hurry, letting the red letters tell them which mornings were suited for lawsuits, which afternoons for festivals, and which entire days were politely unavailable for anything except being a day. If you manage to stay awake all the way to the moment when a secret month steps quietly between February and March, like a librarian returning a book after hours, feel free to subscribe or don't. The calendar will forgive you either way. Rome rarely minded a nap, and the priests who managed time understood better than anyone that dozing is just a private form of intercalation. The men in white robes, the pontifices, looked like ordinary priests, until you noticed they could move appointments with a word. They met under colonnades where breezes made public business sound like gossip, and their authority lived in a set of routines so dull that they became powerful. A herald climbed steps each month to call out the calends, nones and ides, and the crowd listened as if the moon had filed a report. Letters appeared on the tablet, F for fasti when courts might open, N for nefasti when gods politely insisted on silence, and on some days a cryptic NP that meant, please don't schedule anything loud. The Nundine, the 8-day market rhythm, ticked like a heartbeat. Bread sensed it. So did death. because the word calendar nodded to calenday, the day interest was counted. A tiny fact to tuck under your pillow. In Rome, time and money shared a front door key. When the tablet changed, a banker smiled and a fishmonger sighed, which is the economy in two expressions. Life arranged itself around the board's shuffling, symbols with a calm that resembled wisdom. Lawsuits began on days with friendly letters. Marriages leaned toward auspicious afternoons. Oaths preferred mornings that had not already been promised to a god. At street level, it felt homely. A mother sending her son to ask whether tomorrow's letter allowed him to argue about a stolen goose. A baker reminding himself that market day is soon, because olive sellers become braver with prices at the turn of the Nundinay. A magistrate writing to a friend in the provinces, ending the letter with the sort of bureaucratic poetry that comforts empires. To be done on the earliest day the calendar allows. It was all very gentle, until you remembered that behind the gentleness stood people, with the authority to slide a day 2 fingers to the left. Between February and March, the priest kept a key that opened a hidden closet. Inside lived Mercedonius, a month that appeared only when invited, a month that made the solar year and the lunar months shake hands after weeks of pretending not to notice each other. The mathematics is so modest that one almost misses the drama. The lunar 12 months totaled about 354 days. The fields insisted on 365. And so, when necessary, the pontifices slipped in an extra packet of days. They did it with ritual, a trumpet note, and the relaxed certainty of men who had repeated a graceful maneuver many times. A messenger painted new letters. A clerk scratched new entries into public registers. February sacrificed a few days to make room for the guest. And Rome, which adored procedures almost as much as victories, nodded. Strangely, nobody wrote songs about Mercedonius. Perhaps it is difficult to rhyme with a month that has a part-time contract, the extra month work because weather is stubborn. Vines ripen when they please. Sailors wait for seasons. Shepherds prefer spring to truly be spring. Without occasional padding, the calendar drifted backward until April would come sniffling in a winter cloak. Intercalation kept festivals where the sky expected them. Ceres received her offerings when fields felt generous. Shepherds celebrated the Perilia in grass that had actually considered growing. A tiny paradox lay at the center. The artificial month made the year feel natural. If that idea brings you sleep, it has my complete approval. It brought Rome stability, which is a nap for empires. Of course, Rome was also a city. And cities learn quickly that anything predictable can be useful. The power to add or withhold Mercedonius tempted the pontifices the way a loose hinge tempts a fidgeting hand. Elections could be postponed by stretching the year. Terms of office could be prolonged by not allowing the next year to begin just yet. Debts with a crisp due date could be gently pushed while pretending nothing had moved. This is how time, which pretends to be a neutral hallway, becomes a narrow staircase you can control by deciding who reaches it first. It is also how 2 politicians might look at the sky, see the same moon, and take opposite lessons. One praises the gods for a month that keeps sewing on schedule. The other praises the gods for a month that keeps an ally in office. A sleepy micro-hook for the mind. Somewhere a man blamed an election loss on February's length, and I can promise that at least 2 of his aunts agreed. None of this felt dramatic when lived day by day. The priestly decisions arrived like weather forecasts, read by people who knew which side of town carried umbrellas. Magistrates planned speeches without knowing if Mercedonius would drop by this year. Judges looked ahead to court days that might shift slightly under their feet. You could sense the city's flexibility in the legal phrases that ended contracts, according to the calendar that shall then obtain. It's the gentlest possible way to admit. Ask again later. In kitchens, the change meant recipes for feast days moved by a week. In farms, it meant sowing when the stars suggest, but also when the tablet agrees. Two systems of truth hum together, one celestial and one civic, and both were correct as long as no one examined them with the appetite of a philosopher. Then politics noticed what farmers had already known: time is a tool that doesn't look like one. A crafty pontifex could place intercalations to produce convenient shortages and delays. Jurors might find themselves suddenly unavailable if the letter on the board said so. Consuls with awkward trials on the horizon appreciated a month that arrived with the serene expression of a helpful clerk. The Republic discovered a principle useful to anyone who has ever moved a deadline at work. A calendar is the most polite way to say no. If you wanted a reform to arrive more slowly than enthusiasm, you inserted days. If you wanted a budget to go away quietly, you let the year end before it reached the vote. A modern reader will recognize the maneuver instantly. The only difference is that Rome did it in marble courts with sandals instead of conference rooms with coffee dot, as the first century before the Common Era unspooled. The system's small abuses grew out of their shoes. Civil wars do not help clerical accuracy. Intercalations were skipped, then clumped, then forgotten. Some years stretched like taffy, others snapped short, and the festivals began to drift with a stubbornness that looked suspiciously like exhausted priests. It is hard to remember to insert a month when Rome is on fire, metaphorically or otherwise. By the time Julius Caesar became the Pontifex Maximus, the civic year had wandered so far from the sun's year that grape harvests waved at winter festivals across a distance of weeks. Caesar, who had many faults but rarely tolerated bad paperwork, invited astronomers, especially those trained in Alexandria's calm arithmetic, to measure the year with a ruler instead of hope. They returned with a number and a plan, and he did what practical people do with numbers in a crisis. He made a very long year and then promised there wouldn't be another like it. The famous fix was almost boring, which is why it worked. Caesar stretched 1 year to absurd length by stacking extra intercalations until the sun and the civic board finally agreed on where they were standing. Then he set the months on a solar schedule of 365 days, added a leap day every 4th year, and offered the pontifices new tasks that did not include hiding months in their sleeves. Merchants rejoiced. Farmers shrugged with relief. Astrologers smiled because the stars prefer not to be contradicted by paperwork. A small and drowsy punchline: the officials misread the leap year rule at first and inserted leap days a little too frequently, and Augustus later had to put the extra days on a polite diet. Bureaucracy sometimes needs a nap after it wakes up. Even after reform, the old habits haunted conversation. Older Romans remembered when a clever priest could rescue a legal strategy with a well-placed Mercedonius, the way one remembers a favorite cafe that no longer exists except in the pleasant geography of memory. People still consulted the tablet because large machinery courts, markets, festivals loves instructions. That the grand argument between moon and sun had been settled with a treaty that did not require monthly negotiations. If you listen closely, you can hear a city exhale. The baker now knew exactly when the Parentalia would invite his honey cakes. A general knew when campaigning season ceased to be a rumor and became a month with a name. A banker knew the calends with the confidence of someone who loves both interest and punctuality. Precision, like a clean floor, does not call attention to herself. She simply stops people from tripping dot. What survived from the priestly era, besides anecdotes and a faint embarrassment about that very long year, was the idea that time is a kind of civic furniture. It must be dusted, kept level, and occasionally repaired. The priests had done this with an eye on the moon, a stylus on the board, and a quiet faith that order comes in small strokes. Caesar replaced the piece with one that held its polish longer, but the room remained the same. People still walked in every morning and asked, What day is it good for? They still read letters that told them not today, with the gentleness of a neighbor returning a borrowed tool. They still held fast to the comforting notion that tomorrow will be tomorrow when the calendar says so, and not earlier because someone is impatient or later because someone is clever. Empires are heavy, but they rest on simple assurances. If you're still with me, and if your eyes are half closed, that counts as being with me. The beauty of the whole business is how patiently small it is. An extra line of paint. A month introduced with a trumpet note and a shrug. A column of numbers that keeps ships from launching into storms and farmers from apologizing to their vines. A city listening to a herald pronounce the Cowans, allowing a word to turn into a day by unanimous consent. There is power in crowds and legions, but there is also power in a group of neighbors nodding at a schedule. Even the misuses teach a lesson that lingers like the warmth of a sunlit wall. Schedules are extremely persuasive. You can deny an argument. It is harder to deny a date dot, so let the episode drift to a close like a late market day where the last vendor sells. A few figs for the joy of arithmetic. The tablet on the wall whitens for tomorrow's letters. Somewhere a clerk cools his wax stylus and considers how dignified it feels to copy a number carefully. Somewhere a child asks when their birthday will come, and a parent answers without consulting the sky, confident at last that months behave. And in a back room of the temple complex, the old board from an old year leans against other old boards, each carrying the ghost of days that did exactly what they were told. Rome sleeps. The river slides past the bridges as if it too accepts the plan. And the calendar reformed now, steady now, oddly tender rests like a folded garment at the foot of the city's bed, ready to be put on in the morning without discussion. You might not expect empires to rise and fall on the width of a sheet of paper, but shelves and filing cabinets have strong opinions. In the beginning, there were skins and scraps and folios cut by hand. And later, there were names that felt like someone had dropped cards at a stationery shop folio. Quarto, octavo fraction spoken out loud. Each fold like a yawn. Scribes measured with elbows and eyesight, which was part geometry and part optimism. A court clerk might order 2 reams of foolscap, a size named, endearingly, after a juster's cap watermark, as if every contract should wear bells. Printers learned to negotiate with the grain of the paper and with the mood of the weather. Damp days produced polite curls at the corners. Dry days made crisp sounds like good manners. If you're still awake by the time I reveal why the modern sheet loves the square root of 2, you may subscribe out of courtesy. If you're asleep, the paper will fold itself on your behalf. The names wandered. Foolscap in one town could be slightly taller in another. A cousin visiting from out of town who insisted he grew since last summer. Royal Demai crown sizes walked the docks in bales tied with cord and measured in a system that began with about this much. A ledger clerk drew lines with a ruling pen, and the lines rarely asked what exact size they were inhabiting. In monasteries, a choir was 24 sheets. Unless it wasn't, a printer's apprentice could be told to cut to quarto and learn, by the sound of the blade, what quartering felt like, which is a strange sentence to read in bed, but a perfectly ordinary instruction in a shop. Margins were generous, partly to keep thumbprints away from ink, partly because readers liked places for the eye to sit. A small absurdity from the trade. Some customers requested their margins large, because they trusted wide white space to make a book think more kindly of them. Paper, being papery, drifted along rivers of habit until one day a mathematician named Georg Christoph Lichtenberg noticed that if you take a rectangle whose sides stand in the ratio 1 to the square root of 2, you can fold it in half and receive a new rectangle with exactly the same proportions. It is the sort of observation that sits quietly in the corner until someone realizes it could reorganize desks. The elegance is sleepy. The rectangle breeds its own likeness with each fold, like a family reunion where everyone has the same cheekbones. Printers loved it because scaling became arithmetic instead of improv. If a poster did not fit, one could reduce it from A0 to a 1 to a 2 without bruising any design. The paper family would become the A series, with the O defined as 1 square meter in area, a circle of friends built around a single number. Out turned into a 1 by folding once, into a 2 by folding again, marching down until a 4 appeared, the size that lives in your printer and pretends it always existed. Germany, which enjoys an efficient idea, adopted the series during the early 20th century under the name DIN 476. And from there, the clever rectangle stepped onto trains and crossed borders. War tends to teach nations to agree about logistics. Peace is then grateful. Engineers wrote memos that fit in envelopes designed on purpose, a novelty after centuries of trying whatever was in the drawer. Filing cabinets were built to a plan, and suddenly drawers stopped being either an inch too short or romantically roomy. There's a dry poetry in the way an A4 sheet knows the inside of a C4 envelope as if they had rehearsed. A copier operator could select 71% or 141% and feel like a magician whose spell was committee approved. Every fold promised a predictable future. Bureaucracy, which is really just the art of predictable surfaces, smiled with relief. Not everyone moved. Across the Atlantic, American offices continued to court the charming stubbornness of letter and legal. Letter is not a letter in any alphabet, just 8.5 by 11 inches, a size that may trace its ancestry to old molds or to what a comfortable arm could dip and lift. Legal added 3 extra inches as if contracts needed space while thinking. Secretaries learned to ask whether the outgoing packet would meet A4 at the border and acquire a passport of extra margin. Fax machines once danced a clumsy duet with the 2 standards, flattening some pages, stretching others, turning financial statements into interpretive art, a tiny fact to enjoy as you drift. A U.S. government report in the 1980s flirted with adopting A4, and the conclusion, rendered in perfect official calm, was essentially our shelves would sulk. Meanwhile, the A series made friends with the C series, which handles envelopes, and with the B series, which politely fills the gaps between A sizes for posters and passports. There is a reason a B series page looks like a cousin with slightly longer legs. The whole family is an intergenerational conversation about square root of 2, the kind of conversation that happens in a quiet, well-lit room with tea. Stationers keep drawers full of paper just heavier than you asked for, measured in grams per square meter GS mode, a statistic that makes every sheet introduce itself with a handshake. 80 GSM is daily bread. 120 GSM hints at formality. 300 GSM is a small polite plank. The weight is not a weight exactly. It is a density that makes the paper less likely to reveal the shadows of your afternoon thoughts. To the person reading the other side, watermarks, the faint ghosts in the fibers, once branded sheets with mill crests and noble nonsense crowns. Initials, mythical animals who presumably owned a vat. They were made by wires sewn into the mesh that lifted pulp from a vat. The thinner wet fibers dried lighter, leaving an image that appears when a page meets light at a conspiratorial angle. Accountants held paper up to windows the way sailors watch horizons, an everyday ritual that made office workers briefly theatrical. The fool's cap jester cap lingered in some mills long after anyone had worn bells to a council meeting. Even modern pages have watermark cousins, security threads, microtext that pretends to be a line, fibers that glow like shy plankton under ultraviolet lamps. It is all very serious, and yet it is still just damp plant matter encouraged into a rectangle and asked nicely to cooperate. The dances of printers and copiers taught offices a new grammar. Page margins settled into agreeable defaults, 25 millimeters here, 20 there based on what a machine could grab without leaving bite marks. Typists learn that an A4 sheet tolerates about 66 lines in single, spacing if one's ambitions include the bottom of the page. Graphic designers silently think the square root 2 ratio every time a layout jumps smoothly from poster to handout to label. A gentle modern absurdity, the default print to PDF button quietly enforces an international truce among rectangles. If this tangent has kept you awake, you are doing wonderfully. If it has guided you gently toward the border of sleep, that is also a victory, because rectangles are excellent companions for drifting. The old hand sizes did not disappear. They moved to the Museum of Habits. Bookbinders still speak Quarto and Octavo like heirloom words carefully dusted once a week. A stationery shop in Oxford sells Crown Quarto notebooks to students who do not need them, which is the fate of beautiful objects. Legal pads keep their yellow out of tradition more than necessity. The die once concealed poor pulp, and their top binding remembers. A courtroom where a page must lift cleanly with no hinge squeak. People buy A5 notebooks because they fold into a coat pocket like an obedient thought. They buy A3 pads because a big page makes brainstorming feel justified. None of these preferences has the authority of law. They are simply civil agreements between hands and paper. There are, tucked into filing rooms everywhere, human-scale mysteries. Why do hole punches make 2 holes here and 3 there and 4 somewhere else? Because cartridges and binders evolved locally like dialects. Why are margins so large on certain forms? Because someone once needed to bind the left edge in a clerk's volume and feared eating words. Why does a humble receipt roll measure 57 millimeters? Because that width pleased a register manufacturer in an earlier decade, and all the inked math since has chosen not to argue. The history of paper sizes is a long series of decisions that look temporary and turned out to be furniture. Factories and mills run like calming tide pools. Pulp moves along in a white river until the sheet forms and slides between rollers like a gentle negotiation. A watermark cylinder embosses an image as if whispering a rumor into wet fiber. The sheets cut, stacked, rewrapped in neat reams that announce 500 like a promise. Somewhere a packing list explains A4 210 by 297 millimeters, 80 GSM, and a forklift nods. The joke is that an entire day's production, measured in tons, will disappear into offices where it becomes meeting agendas. Shipping labels, small origami cranes made during a particularly long call, and notes that say, "See back," even when there is plenty of room on the front. The 2 rectangle keeps performing its unshowy trick. When you fold it, it agrees to be itself at a smaller scale. Copy machines domesticated this trick with buttons. Architects stopped muttering when their drawings fit equally well at a 1 and a 3 during site visits. Teachers discovered that handouts reduced neatly without making pictures look like they forgot to eat. A tiny delight. If you cut a 4 in half to get a 5, then fold the 2 A5 south together, you can make a booklet where the pages appear in order as if the paper understood narrative structure. It is not magic. It is geometry in pajamas. From time to time, a conference tries to reformat the world. Someone proposes moving the United States to A4 or persuading every nation to love 1 3-hole spacing. The proposals generate reports with careful charts, and then the charts are printed on the old sizes because the new sizes have not yet been approved. And by the last page, everyone feels tender toward human inconsistency. Even so, the E-series continues to spread not through edict, but through quiet convenience. It is easier to share templates when the rectangles speak the same language, easier to ship when boxes agree about what they are carrying, easier to fold when you already know what shape the fold will love. This is how standards win. Not with drums, but with slightly nicer drawers dotted home. The rectangles are more relaxed. Shopping lists prefer tore-off corners of a 4 that become a 6 by accident. Children draw on a 3 because big spaces forgive big ideas. A 4 bears recipes copied in pencil with a practical grease stain near the butter. A 5 acts as a polite journal during train rides. A O appears only when someone believes a wall needs a reminder the size of a window. The most persuasive argument for a size is the experience of reaching for it without thinking. When the sheet at hand accepts your handwriting the way a familiar pillow accepts a cheek, a standard has done its work. There are tucked into the story tiny absurdities to keep the mind happily occupied as it relaxes. The French Revolutionary calendar tried to reform not only months but also paper, measuring in new units with new names. And surprisingly, few people wanted to order 1 hectare of handouts. A British committee once argued earnestly about whether school children's exercise books should be a 4 or a 5, a debate that produced more tea than conclusions. A manufacturer produced a batch of slightly not a 4 and labeled it a 4 asterisk, which is the typographical equivalent of a sigh. Somewhere, perhaps tonight, a person will open a drawer of carefully saved offcuts, shapes that are almost and roughly, and will use them to test a pen because old paper is generous that way. You can let your attention soften around the edges now, the way paper fibers soften when a sheet is pressed and dried. Imagine a warehouse at evening, forklift asleep, reams stacked like very patient books, the neat roar of machines quieted into a hum that remembers numbers. Somewhere between the stacks, a thin rectangle thinks about how tomorrow will be folded to fit inside a C5 envelope, or cut into a 6 cards that will hold telephone numbers no one dials anymore, or left whole and printed with minutes from a meeting that will conclude, contentedly, that the next meeting should be on Thursday. The square root of 2 lingers in the corners like a lullaby with a small calculator inside it. Everything lines up. Everything can be scaled. Nothing requires a trumpet. If you are still awake, you have learned that the indifferent miracle of our desks is simply proportion. If you are drifting, then the proportions have done their job a second time by becoming rhythm. Fold, halve, repeat, like breathing. History rarely gives us such tidy rectangles to hold. Most stories are messy. This one is blessedly rectangular, with paperweights. The day winds down. Someone places a fresh ream beside a humming printer and straightens the stack twice, just to feel the edges behave. The light above the copier clicks off with a small bureaucratic mercy, and the world, tucked into folders that finally fit the drawers they were promised, closes its files and lets the night file everything else. You might not expect a handful of priests with wax tablets to make the moon late for dinner, but in Rome, the men with styluses adjusted the sky with a shrug. In a city that pretended to be ruled by swords, the people who measured months with pebbles and scratches quietly steered harvests. Elections, rent day, and when you were allowed to sue your neighbor about that wall. Time, as it turns out, is a very obedient citizen when it hears the voice of a clerk. If you're still awake in a few minutes, you can subscribe out of solidarity with calendars. If you're asleep, that is also a form of compliance, and the calendar thanks you for your service. Picture a low-lit office near the forum. Shelves line the walls with chalked sticks, knotted cords, and tablets that look like they contain gossip but are actually serious about days. The pontifices, Rome's official priests, sit like librarians who accidentally wandered into politics and decided to stay. They keep lists of festival days, court days, and those quiet days when no public business can be done because the gods allegedly have scheduled something else. A little boy runs errands, carrying messages that read like small spells, market days and 8 days. Court resumes on the calends. If you have a cow to dedicate, please return after the nones. the Pontifex Maximus, whose title sounds enormous because it is, presses his stylus into wax, and the city's schedule rearranges itself like soldiers at the sound of a trumpet. You don't hear doubt their power rests on something both dull and beautiful. Months will not sit still. The moon glides through cycles of about 29.5 days, and 12 of those add up to a year that is noticeably shorter than the sun's. Fields grow on the sun's time. Rent contracts prefer precision. Priests pat the moon and say, "Kindly, you are lovely, but we must keep the barley on schedule." The solution, classic and sleepy, is to insert an extra month now and then an intercalary cushion. A polite fold in the year so that festivals promised to spring don't wander into winter like guests who miss the street number. Rome's special extra month has a name that sounds like a burp of Latin, Mercedonius. It appears between February and March when invited, and it does not complain that it is only half a guest. An editor of days takes a knife to the year, chooses a neat seam, and slips the piece in. This is not arithmetic for the proud. It is administration for the patient. The formula the pontifices use is part rule, part tradition, part we'll see how the auspices look. Some years meet a nudge, some meet a shove. The pontiffs check the shadows at noon, consult previous years, listen to farmers who say the vines are early, and then announce with gentle authority that there will be more February than usual. Because Rome does everything in public except the things it prefers to do at a whisper, the announcement is posted on a board. People pretend to be surprised. Merchants adjust their chalk on the price columns. A certain senator who hoped the election would be soon rehearses a patient smile as his candidacy slides. Sideways by an insert of day's dot, you can feel the city accept the change in small motions. The granary clerk takes out a longer abacus, joking he keeps it for months with ambitions. A teacher tells her students they have the rare joy of repeating the same verse for another week. The students choose to believe this is an honor. Temple attendants fetch more oil for lamps because festivals expanded like bread left near a warm brick. Everyone knows there is nothing mystical about it. And yet lines at bakeries elongate like shadows because rumor and Rome also counts days. Markets are Rome's heartbeat. Every 8th day, the nundine. The city inhales bargain shouting and exhales leftovers and stories. When the priests insert their slice of Mercedonius, the market has to slide on the bench and make room. Imagine a fishmonger explaining to a customer that yes, it is market day, but also, curiously, it is still February and will remain February until the priests are satisfied that rams look sufficiently spring-like. Courts shift too. Some days you can call your adversary by name and read from a tablet in a proud, ordinary voice. Other days the calendar tilts its head and says, "Not today." A lawsuit breathes out, and the margins where decisions would have been written stay agreeably blank. The gods, when suspects, appreciate the paperwork. Watch how the adds on and do not do days multiply. A debt's due date was perhaps the Ides of March. After intercalation, the Ides pack a small suitcase and move in with the end of April, quite content. A father calculates his son's coming-of-age ceremony and discovers the boy will be a man a month later than planned. The boy discovers he will be a boy a month longer than expected and appears suspiciously satisfied. A farmer who carries weather in his bones measures not by tablets but by birds. He nods and says the priests have caught up with swallows this year, which is a compliment, because swallows are notoriously proud of being punctual. Now, to the quiet joke that everyone eventually gets when a handful of officials control the lever that adds or withholds days. The lever becomes a political device dressed as a calendar. Elections require auspicious dates. Trials need proper court days. Firming leases turn on the arrival of spring. Military commands lapse when a given time is up. A pontifex with a friend can give him a longer campaign simply by refusing to invite Mercedonius to dinner. A pontifex with an enemy can crumble the schedule under an extra moon. It is all very civically responsible and also astonishingly convenient. One senator squints at the sky, which looks fine, then at the pontifex, who looks satisfied, and decides that nature appears content with the decision to postpone his opponent's prosecution. Here the micro-absurdities gather, quiet as dust and twice as everywhere. A magistrate explains that jurors cannot be sworn because today is a holiday one announced this morning. A general in a far province receives a letter that lengthens his term by days he cannot see. A baker complains that the extra market crowd buys the wrong amount of bread, and his loaves feel misunderstood. Somewhere an augur studies the flight of birds and discovers the birds, too, seem to be circling around a convenient delay. It is all legal. It is all pious. The year is a resource, and like all Roman resources, it answers to whoever keeps the ledger dot. Every so often, the arithmetic loses its place entirely. In the middle of the 1st century before the Common Era, the calendar has been nursed and poked by politics so enthusiastically that it develops a fever. Winter festivals are appearing in autumn boots. Leases are confused about their birthdays. The vintage arrives on a day formerly known as not harvest. People call it the year of confusion, though a patient friend might argue it is the culmination of many small decisions, which is less dramatic but more accurate. Think of the city as a watch with many hands, all of them correct in the sense that each knows what it is pointing at, none of them correct at the same time. It is, in a soft way, charming, like a chorus rehearsing different verses with confidence. Enter a general who's tired of rescheduling. Triumphs Gaius Julius Caesar, who, among many traits, possesses a cultural allergy to crypt columns and misnumbered days. He has soldiers to pay, tax tables to please, and a taste for the measurable. He listens to the priest's explanations with the same expression he uses for bridge repair. He summons astronomers from Alexandria, where the sky has been a textbook for so long that even the stars shrug formally when addressed. The astronomers bring the sun's year with them, measured at roughly 365 1/4 days, a number so gentle it makes you feel secure just to repeat it. Caesar looks at Rome's calendar like a craftsman examining a wobbly stool, then announces calmly, like someone changing a menu, that the stool will be sanded, braced, and made to stand without assistance. The reform is not a thunderclap so much as a very thorough sweeping. First, and this is the part that makes chroniclers rub their eyes, Caesar extends 1 year 46 BCE to a heroic length by inserting extra months and days until the calendar's knees stop knocking. Think of it as an accounting reconciliation conducted by daylight. People lived through the longest official year Rome had seen, a season so plump with days that birthdays occurred with unusual frequency, which is a pleasant byproduct. Then, with the misalignments softened, he introduces a new rule you know intimately, even if you never invited it to dinner. Ordinary years of 12 months totaling 365 days. And every 4th year, a leap day to honor the quarter that remains. February accepts the extra day with the patience of a month that has seen things. Intercalation, once a matter of priestly discretion, becomes a rule with a calendar pin stuck through it. This is where the city learns the subtle joy of predictability. Festivals return to the correct seasons as if they had received written invitations with proper dates and nice fonts. Harvest rituals meet actual harvest, which is tidy. The market days, still happily every 8 days, now march in a sequence that satisfies bookkeepers. Courts discover schedules that can be posted months in advance without being edited by birds. The pontifices do not lose their status. They shift tasks, becoming caretakers of rites rather than referees of the sun and moon. Their office grows quieter, and quiet in a public building is a sign of competence. You can imagine the ripple effects. Architects with sundials feel briefly underemployed, then relieved when the shadows agree with the new arithmetic. School children learn lists of months that stay put. They no longer need to ask their teacher whether February intends any dramaturgy this year. A woman planning a wedding counts forward and finds the date dependable in a way that settles the heart. A satirist complains faintly that the new system offers fewer opportunities for jokes about calendars, then discovers that bureaucracy will always provide material if one waits. The leap day itself is a small, charming absurdity. It slides into February like an extra biscuit in a basket and insists there's nothing to discuss. People born on it acquire a conversational trick they may deploy for the rest of their lives. Technically, they are younger than their furniture. Lawyers with an appetite for complications briefly argue about whether a contract signed on the extra day has a birthday of its own. The city decides gently that yes, of course it does, and the contract is quite content to celebrate as needed. What survives from all this is not so much a single man's reform as a culture's new habit. The Julian year walks out of Rome and into provinces, then over mountains and across seas, and people adopt it remotely, like a shared recipe that travels because it reliably becomes bread. It carries the faint scent of Alexandria's libraries and Rome's filing cabinets. Centuries later, scholars will adjust it again, the Gregorian tidy up, because that quarter day is not exactly a quarter, but that is a future yawn. The important thing for drowsy minds to hold is that a rule replaced a discretion, and the world breathed out. Still, you can feel the old priestly office lingering like a memory of varnish and wood. Calendars remain communal property. Cities keep public lists of days when offices are open and days when they will not admit paperwork because a festival is sitting in the lobby wearing laurel. School terms start because someone with a pen says so. Legislatures adjourn at times that sound majestic but are really scheduled by people with access to rooms. Election day is not a planetary event. It is a box drawn on a month by a committee. The power to decide when decisions may be made still attracts hands that enjoy deciding. There are the softer legacies, too. We still speak about months as if they have moods. February sulks. March is breezy. April pretends to be helpful and then rains on your sandals. This is how people talk when their ancestors once petitioned priests for a handful of days and were sometimes granted mercy. Rent falls due with a solemnity inherited from temples. Paydays cluster near the end of months like goats collecting at a gate. Long weekends are our secular intercalations, slipped into the year with the kindly audacity of busy clergy. And the effect is the same, a reset so gentle, you understand it with your shoulders. The smallest details keep the story tucked into daily life. Latin names stack like small, comforting bricks, calends, nones, ides underneath the months that now wear global outfits. Our phones still consult tables that began as chalk marks. When the software says, this event repeats every 4 years, it is performing Caesar's arithmetic in a silicone whisper. Your dentist offering a slot in March is, in a minor way, performing the work once owned by men in togas who declared that March might have to wait. Sometimes it is pleasant to think of the year of confusion while holding a quiet, ordinary planner. There were farmers whose ripening figs sat awkwardly under winter's name. There were brides who discovered the lucky day had shifted to a cousin of a day. There were accountants who left extra space in ledgers because space is the only instrument that calms an unruly number. And then there was a long year that made room for everyone to take a breath, after which the months began behaving again, as if they had been gently reminded that they are guests, not hosts. If you are still listening, you might notice how soothing it is that days can be arranged without argument once you choose a rule. Human life does not often receive such gifts. The priests with styluses, the generals with astronomers, the carpenters who carved numbers into public boards, all of them were, in their different ways, caretakers of a shared illusion that works because we agree to believe it. We do not live by the sun or the moon alone. We live by postings. Tomorrow arrives because the calendar allows it, which is a sentence that sounds ridiculous only if you've never seen a room full of people. Refuse to begin a meeting until someone confirms the date. Outside the forum, the moon still pulls its patient arcs across a sky that never inquires about office hours. The sun stands by with the quiet confidence of a celestial clock that doesn't mind being consulted. Somewhere a clerk places a fresh tablet on a shelf, satisfied that the sequence of festival days now leads neatly to harvest, and harvest to market, and market to court, and court back to ordinary days, which are perhaps the best invention of all. A pigeon who has never misunderstood a schedule lands on the temple steps exactly when it means to. A bell in a small shrine marks the end of daylight with a tone that has no politics. And Rome, that excellent amateur of administration, closes its office of time for the evening, secure in the knowledge that tomorrow has been written down and will therefore occur. Which is, when you think about it in bed, the loveliest bureaucratic miracle of them all.